It's my pleasure to introduce Paul Hutchings, who will be discussing Zen commandments. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. It's great to be here. First time giving a talk, and so thanks to all the PyOhio people for giving me this opportunity. This talk, actually, the idea for it came from PyCon of last year. I was talking with a friend, and he said, blank, I forget what it was. It's not really Pythonic, doesn't really fit Zen of Python. And I said, sort of as an offhand comment, there's a lot of stuff in Python that doesn't really kind of follow that, seem Pythonic or fit the Zen of Python or whatever. And there was no fistfights or arguments from that, but that kind of got me interested in the relationship between the Zen of Python and the Python language and the community and how it's evolved over the years. And as we'll see, this is actually a pretty important year for the Zen of Python. A little bit about me, not terribly important. I'm sure most people probably maybe don't care that much, but a little bit about me. I work at a company called KSM Technology Partners. I do mostly Java full stack development, so I've recently been able to do some stuff with Python at work, but most of my Python experience over the past 5 years or so has been personal projects and stuff that I used it while in school is where I got started. But otherwise, I'm just a guy. I'm not a core dev. I'm not a major maintainer or creator of projects, so, any opinions or criticisms or thing, I don't want to come across like some sort of armchair expert or whatever. I do understand that these people, there's limitations and things they have to work around. So I'm not anyone special coming up and saying these things. I'm just a person that likes Python. So we'll start with some exclusive Zen facts, because this year, like I said, is an important year for the Zen of Python, and it's been 25 years since it was originally posted by Tim Peters. He originally posted it to the Python mailing list in June of 1999, and then conveniently, it's also 20 years since it was published as PEP number 20. So it's an important milestone, and I didn't know that at the time when I originally thought of doing a talk on the Zen of Python. I kind of realized that after the fact. I was like, oh, this is going to be a perfect year for that. There are 19 principles in there, kind of a weird number. Well, there were supposed to be 20. Guido was supposed to write the 20th. He hasn't, so it's still vacant there. And another thing I thought would be kind of interesting is looking at other languages and other ecosystems out there and seeing what other similar statements of ideals or principles are there that we might could sort of compare the Zen of Python to. And what I thought was interesting is I actually didn't find all that much out there, as much as I thought I was going to. The Zen of Python is a bit unique in that regard, and the things that I did find were not quite as extensive as it. The creator of Perl, Larry Wall, has quoted saying that there are 3 great virtues of a programmer, not necessarily Perl, but kind of close enough, and they are laziness, impatience, and hubris. And I found a language called Ponylang. It's similar to Erlang in that it's based on, centered around concurrency and using the actor model, and they have what they call the Pony philosophy, which has these 5 tenets. And something I want to point out is that these are in order of priority. So correctness, you should never sacrifice anything else for correctness. That's number 1. But you can always sacrifice completeness. And I want to point this out because there's a very distinct hierarchy here and a very distinct order that if you're someone who wants to sort of evaluate your code and say, am I sort of following these, you have a very clear guide on what to do and what order to kind of check these things on. Similar but less strongly correlated, there's Ruby cones, but those are sort of more of a tutorials than they are really a statement of ideals. The Rust book has an introduction where they mention empowerment being the main goal of the language there, but they don't have a whole sort of poem of stuff. And then branching outside of languages into more programming in general, we have other philosophies like worse is better versus the right thing. That's from a Richard Gabriel essay from the 80s, I believe, and he also calls it the New Jersey approach, if you've ever heard that term. Highly recommend reading that. It's about quality of software versus functionality of software. And then we also have the classic Unix philosophy, do one thing, do it well. And so it's great that we have this document that tells us exactly what we should be doing while writing Python, and we just have to follow that all the time, right? Well, I have a PSA, a Python surprise announcement here. The Zen of Python is not like a Bible or a gospel or doctrine or some kind of hard and fast rules that you should be adhering to. And I fell into this trap as well. When I first started researching this talk, I had always had this idea in mind of, I should be following this very closely while writing the code. And then I kind of learned that it's a little more lighthearted and humorous than that. Even looking at the introduction to it, Tim Peters succinctly channels the BDFL's guidelines into 20 aphorisms, but only 19 of them have been written down. It's not really a very serious introduction there. And so it is kind of a bit of a joke, It was not a serious document when he wrote it. And, so if you're thinking of buying one of these, Zen of Python blocks to put next to your, I don't know how well that actually comes out on the projector there, but if you're thinking of buying one of these to put on your nightstand and recite the Zen of Python before bed every night or something, maybe you don't need to go that far and do that, or maybe you do and you're taking the joke even further than was intended. I'll leave that up to you whether you want to do that or not. So should we just throw it away? Okay, it's not a serious document. We should just ignore it. Push it aside. It's 25 years old. It's not relevant anymore. Well, we should look at what the origin story of it is. Why do we have this thing? Like I said before, it's a bit unique in that most other communities don't have a document like this that is both as extensive, but also it's not very black and white, detailed, very strict. It's sort of broad and general and abstract. We're going to have to time travel a little bit back to 1999 when Tim Peters wrote for the Zen of Python. It was in a mailing list about Python 2.0, and among other things, there was talks of rewriting it in Java, adding this feature, that feature from this other language, and a general push from outside forces as Python was getting more popular and mainstream to sort of shape and mold it as other people saw fit. And one of the members of the mailing list posted and wanted to know, would Tim and Guido be willing to collaborate on something that would set out some principles and guidelines for people that are coming to Python from outside and that immediately want to twist and bend it to how they want it to be, how they think it should be rather than how it is. And so I kind of look at this and go, well, this is sort of a bit of maybe a resistance to cargo culting or flavor of the month kind of stuff. And something that suggests fundamental idiomatic recommendations, the spirit of the language. This is where we get Zen from, a Python Zen. And it's something to go off and think about when all of these outside forces are saying, oh, you should do this, you should do that. Why isn't it like this? Why isn't it like that? And so balance, obviously, that's a bit cliche for something that's called Zen of Python, but that's a big takeaway that I take from reading those sort of introductory posts leading up to it, as well as restraint. All these things that different people want or that might be good ideas and might be great and might be useful, but show some restraint here. Calm down. Let's think about what is going to be good for the language and the community overall. And this is what Tim Peters wrote in response. Here's the outline that I think Guido would start with if you were to put down these principles. Wink. Then you have the Zen of Python, and then he ends there with, if answer to any Python design issue isn't obvious after reading this, well, I just give up. Another wink. I think he couldn't have been a bit more clear of this isn't super serious or super hardcore. This is kind of tongue-in-cheek, But there's still a good amount of value in there. I mean, think about how much we quote some of the lines, some more than others for sure, but how much it's permeated the community. Even at this very conference, I'm probably the fourth person to talk about or mention the Zen of Python in something. So it's everywhere. Clearly, there has got to be some good stuff in there, you know. Otherwise, we wouldn't keep talking about it 25 years later. But it's not going to hold our hands, and it's not going to spell it out for us. It's not going to say, this is what you should be doing in this situation, and this is right from wrong. So how has it influenced Python then over the last 25 years? You know, what is it trying to say to us? So let's take a look at some. I'm not going to go through the whole you know, Zen of Python, just some pieces there. What happens if we try to Zen a little bit too much, take it a little too far, you know, take it a little too seriously maybe? And how does the language maybe push back against that? How does the language, and has it evolved, its features, try to keep us from maybe doing that, or try to promote some of the good aspects of the Zen of Python? And I'm going to start with probably the most common or famous one that gets reiterated, which is explicit is better than implicit. We've all heard that before. And I'm going to do it with a very simple example. And this is one that I actually gave, started off a lunch and learn that I gave at work a year ago about Python. Remember, I work with Java developers, so it's a very innocent looking example for people that have worked in Java or many other languages, which is just, we want a string message here, and you know, the number of apples is 3, right? What could go wrong with that? Well, Python doesn't let you do that. And this really shocked a lot of my coworkers because, again, they're used to being able to just do that in a lot of languages. And I think also, too, because people sometimes conflate the fact that Python is a dynamic language with, they think, oh, it's like JavaScript, or it has some sort of weak typing, or it's, you know, sort of the Wild West of this stuff. And what this example, I think, really makes us stop and think, you know, what are we actually trying to do here, you know? And we probably don't really think about this when we're doing things like this, but what we want is the string representation of the integer, you know? And Python says, okay, that's fine, but then tell me that's what you want, you know? And you might think, well, why doesn't it just always do that? Why doesn't under add just always just call string on the right-hand side of the operand? Because, you know, that's clearly what you want to do when you're doing string plus something else, right? And maybe, maybe not, right? This very carefully constructed example that I made, we have decaf, and well, maybe we want the string representation of 5, but what if decaf is a hexadecimal number, which, if you're curious, is 14,600,959, and we want to add 5 to that? What if we actually want to do arithmetic here? Python says, that's fine, but tell me that's what you want. You know, tell me this is a hexadecimal integer number and that you want to add 5 to it. And I'm sure a lot of you are probably thinking, well, this is a very contrived example. Nobody actually does stuff like this in the real world with, you know, hexadecimal numbers as strings. But my point is that being very intentional and very clear with what you want is such a core fundamental part of the language, and underpins everything else that comes on top of that. In the face of ambiguity, refuse the temptation to guess. You know, Python's not going to guess for us what we want here. It's saying you must tell me what you want, and it's a very core fundamental thing. Now contrast that with a more modern feature, f-strings, right? By default, when you interpolate a variable in an f string, you know, it's going to do the string representation of that, basically the equivalent of like calling string on that. You know, if you want to do something else, like if you want repr, it's hard to find a good example of repr in the standard types. You know, string, it puts quotes, extra quotes around there, but a lot of them are it's kind of the same thing. But if you want something else, you have to tell it that. But it is going to cut you some slack by the default is you probably want the string representation, so I'm going to do that. It's a little less explicit, for sure, but there's some elements of like practicality beats purity in there. You know, it's kind of a spectrum that I like to think about. You know, some features are going to promote some things more than others. Some are going to be more implicit. Some are going to be more explicit. Explicit stuff like keyword arguments, named arguments are a great example of a feature that promotes explicitness a lot more, whereas something like decorators are a little more implicit. Chris Negebauer has a great talk from PyCon AU 2021 about abusing and misusing decorators to do all kinds of unexpected stuff. So highly recommend going and watching that. So let's look at another one here. Flat is better than nested. That's another really common one that we like to see. Python promotes this by having the white space actually be part of the language syntax. You know, in a lot of other languages that uses braces and other things, you know, you can, the white space doesn't matter. The formatting doesn't matter here, but in Python it does. And one of the things it does is it kind of encourages less nesting of multiple nested loops and conditionals and other stuff because, well, now it's affecting, you know, how it looks on the page. For loops versus list comprehensions is the example we're going to look at here. So if I have this class of person, they've got a name, they got some children that are also people, we have a list of them, we have a list of some that are in trouble for something. If we want people that are named Jeff, another falsehood about names is that it's going to be like normalized in lowercase in one field. So this is how we would do it with a for loop. We got some nesting going on there. List comprehensions that were not originally part of the language allows us to do that in a flatter way. You know, it's flat is better than nested here. Right? We don't have two or three indents going on here. But if we get a more complex example, like what if Jeff has some bad kids, you know, and we want to yell their name uppercased, and we have to go through and find all of them. You know, you kind of already see where this is going because the code doesn't fit on the slide without a scroll bar or without me making the font really small or something like that. All of a sudden, maybe this isn't quite such a great idea. And if you take it to the really extreme and you just get, I just Googled really complex list comprehension, and you can find lots of Stack Overflow and Reddit posts of stuff like this. List comprehensions are really susceptible to code golfing and leak code behavior and just trying to cram stuff together like that. Readability counts. If we try to make everything super flat at all costs, we're obviously sacrificing the readability at this point. So what do we do? Well, let's try adding some indentation, reformatting our thing. It's a little better, there's still a lot going on in there. What about the for loops? Maybe for loops are sometimes better, for readability. Neither of these are really all that great, in my opinion. I don't really think, I think we can do better. Raymond Henninger has a great thing, there must be a better way. Keep it simple. Maybe we realize we're doing way too much here, trying to cram all this stuff into one expression, and so we're going to break it up. Each line here is only doing one thing. It's going to filter, it's going to do a transformation, or it's going to flat map a nested thing. Simple is better than complex. There might be more code overall here in terms of characters, but the code is simpler. Hopefully it's easier to read and understand and wrap your head around. And this is kind of how I like to think of this. We have these different competing ideals from the Zen of Python. We have the confines of the Python language that are all kind of pulling us in these different directions, but hopefully it's steering us towards a better path rather than just trying to pick one thing and stick to it no matter what. And an addendum, this is something I realized this morning but didn't really have time to go through and rework the slides, is that was a pretty literal interpretation of flat nested white space, how it looks on the screen. Even if we package stuff up into functions, the logic nesting is also, I think, probably maybe more what Tim Peters was talking about here, where you have a chain of function calls, this calls that, calls that, calls that, and it can make it hard to follow the code, even if they're simple things versus, this is very similar to the list comprehension thing that I just did, but it's also flatter in terms of the logic. Rather than having A call B, call C, whatever, we're just call one, then call the other, then call the other. So now we're going to get to this, the elephant in the room. This is probably the most misunderstood line in the PEP for two reasons. One, you'll notice I bolded preferably and obvious. Those tend to get omitted. A lot of times people are like, oh, the Zen of Python says there must be only one way to do it. Well, no, these two words make a big difference in how you read that, preferably and obvious. And as Steph showed us with her talk, a lot of these come in pairs, and people tend to omit the following line, which really changes the meaning of this, And Tim Peters himself said that this line in particular is really more of a joke than any other in there, regarding the dashes and whether you put a space around them or not. He says there's two conventions there, with spaces, without spaces, and there's no agreement on which one is the right way, and he just went and did it a third way to mess with people even more. But that tends to kind of go over everyone's head. And I'm going to make a different argument that we've been reading this all wrong, this particular one, and it's not about whether there's one way to format a string or three ways to format a string, or that it has anything to do with the choices and options for tools that we have available when we're writing our code, the things that are provided to us. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with intent. Are we making our intent clear when we write our code? How many times have you read a piece of code that was written by someone else that you're reading through this and you're like, I don't understand this at all. It's like it was written in another language, like Dutch. And, what I believe he means here is, it's really obvious when we're writing the code what we're trying to do here. We should be striving to write our code such that when it's as obvious to the next person that has to read it as it is to us when we're writing it. The next person that has to come 6 months, a year, might even be us coming back to it. And so the question that we really should be asking ourselves when we come across this line about one obvious way to do it is not how many ways are there to format strings, add stuff to lists in Python, but is Python helping us make our intent clear when we're writing software? And over the last 25 years, has that intent become clearer? Are we communicating better with our code, with Python now, than we have in the past? Is it making that part better? And that's, I think, the real questions that we should be asking with this, not why is there X number of ways to do something very specific in Python. So to close out, okay, I'm not too far under time there. Let's go back to that 20th aphorism. And that was vacant. It was kind of left as an exercise to Guido. You could think about it as an exercise to the audience as well, but I'll give you mine at the very least. If Guido's not the BDFL anymore, but if he still was, and he was going to write this 20th aphorism, and he was going to try and keep it in the spirit of Tim Peters, not too serious and lighthearted, he might write something kind of like this. It's things change, things evolve. Like we saw before with the plus operand versus f strings. Things evolve over time. Maybe we don't need to be quite as rigid with some of that stuff. And again, balance, restraint. There's been a lot of great features added to Python over the last 25 years. But kind of thinking, is this helping us with what our goals are? Is our intent? Are we communicating well? Is this Python code, helping us do what we want to do? And those are the kinds of things that we want to think about, and that the Zen of Python is really about, is think about these things holistically. Don't be like, this line of code is not flat. This line of code is, I'm doing something two different ways here in my program. It's, is this piece of code that I'm writing, clear? Is it nice to read? Does it do all those things? And yeah, that's about it. Thank you all for enduring more Zen of Python talk. These are somewhere I got some of the information. That's the original mailing list there. That's the PEP. Great resources, by the way, reading that whole mailing list. There's a lot of very interesting stuff in there. And I'm not really a big social media person. If you want to, that's my Mastodon. you can add me on LinkedIn. I'll be really honest though, I don't really use LinkedIn. So if you send me a private message, I'm not gonna see it. So, but it's a conference, so people expect LinkedIn. So there it is. And yeah, I guess that's it. Thank you.